The snowstorm rolled in fierce that night, smothering the quiet town in silence, wrapping the streets in a blanket so thick that only the dim orange glow of lonely lamps broke through the whiteout. Roads vanished, cars sat stranded, and the icy wind howled through empty alleys like restless spirits on the hunt. But on the edge of that frozen town, behind a leaning picket fence, stood a small weathered cottage. Smoke curled gently from its chimney, a sign of life in a night that seemed to swallow everything whole. Inside sat an elderly woman named Eleanor. She rested by the crackling fire, her silver hair pinned neatly, her wrinkled fingers working patiently at a set of knitting needles. She had endured many winters in that little home, but this one felt colder, lonelier. Her husband had passed long ago. Her children had built lives far away, and the nights now stretched longer than the days. That evening, as the blizzard screamed against her windows, she closed her eyes and whispered a simple prayer, that anyone wandering the storm might find warmth and safety. She had no way of knowing how swiftly that prayer would be answered. A sudden knock jolted her from her thoughts. It rattled the old wooden door, and her heart leapt into her throat. At her age, visitors in the dead of night were rare, especially on a night like this. Gathering her shawl around her shoulders, she shuffled to the door and pulled it open. What she saw made her freeze. Standing in the swirling snow were 15 men, broad-bearded, clad in heavy leather jackets marked with the infamous emblem of the Hells Angels. Their faces were raw from the bitter cold, their breath rising in icy clouds, their boots sinking deep into the drifts. Behind them, their motorcycles leaned like frozen beasts, chrome hidden beneath layers of frost. For a heartbeat, Eleanor felt her knees weaken. These were men with reputations, men townsfolk whispered about, men others crossed the street to avoid. But then she noticed, their hands trembling, their lips blue with cold, their eyes heavy with exhaustion. They weren't threats tonight. They were simply human beings losing their battle against the storm. Without hesitation, Eleanor stepped aside and said softly, "Come in before you freeze." The men exchanged startled looks. Doors usually slammed in their faces. Yet here stood a frail woman barely reaching their shoulders, offering them shelter without fear. One by one they stepped inside. The little house seemed to shrink as their heavy frames filled it, snow dripping onto her old wooden floor. Eleanor bustled into the kitchen, pulling together whatever food she had left. A pot of soup, some bread, and a bit of stew from earlier. It wasn't much, but she served it with a smile, setting the table as though she had been expecting them. The men sat stiffly at first, their massive bodies crammed onto flowered couches and creaky chairs, unsure how to act in such gentle company. But as the hours passed and the storm howled on, the ice between them thawed. They told her bits of their journey, how the storm had caught them on the highway. Motels were full, and their bikes were nearly frozen solid outside. Without shelter, they would never have made it to morning. Eleanor listened quietly, topping off mugs of coffee, laying out quilts that smelled faintly of lavender. One by one, the men drifted to sleep, curled up in her blankets, their snores rattling the walls. She stayed awake a long while, watching them rest by her fire. She had never known the joy of suns, but that night she felt as though she had been given 15 of them. By dawn, the blizzard had passed. The world outside shimmered with untouched snow, glittering like glass in the pale sun. The bikers stirred slowly, stretching, thanking her in their rough voices. She made them a simple breakfast, eggs, toast, and coffee, before they stepped out into the cold. Their leader, a tall man with steely gray eyes, paused at the door. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low but firm, "we'll never forget this." She smiled, patted his arm, and wished them safe travels. Moments later, the roar of their engines faded into the snowy hills, leaving Eleanor alone once more in her small, quiet house. She thought it would end there. Just one extraordinary memory of the night. Her home became a refuge for men the world called dangerous. But kindness rarely ends where it begins. The very next morning, as Eleanor scattered birdseed in her yard, she heard it, a distant rumble rolling across the valley. At first it sounded like thunder, but it grew louder, closer, until the ground itself seemed to tremble. Down the snowy road came a sight that made her cover her mouth in shock. Not a dozen, not 20, but 100 motorcycles, engines growling in unison, their riders clad in the same leather insignias. They surrounded her little home, their numbers filling the street as neighbors peeked anxiously from behind curtains. From the front of the crowd, the tall leader dismounted and approached her, a bouquet of fresh flowers in hand. How he had found them in the dead of winter was a mystery she never solved. "You gave us shelter when no one else would," he said. "We told the brothers, word spread. And we don't forget." Behind him, bikers unloaded bags of groceries, stacks of firewood, boxes of blankets, tools, and supplies. They repaired her fence, shoveled her walk, fixed the squeaky hinges of her porch. Her home, once silent, buzzed with life, laughter, and the rumble of bikes. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt truly alive. As the sun dipped low, the riders gathered in front of her yard, engines revving together in a thunderous salute. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she waved from the porch. They rode away, their sound fading into the snowy horizon, but Eleanor knew she would never feel alone again. She had family now, family on two wheels, bound not by blood, but by kindness. Glowing star, if this story touched your heart, like the video, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to Kindness Corner Stories so we can keep bringing you stories that prove compassion can change the world. And tell us in the comments, would you have opened the door that night? Because sometimes the smallest act of warmth can light a fire that lasts a lifetime.